A couple of years ago, one evening, I was doing a wake service here in the parish, and I just finished up. I was leaving, actually, and on my way out, the funeral director grabs me and he says, "Can you do me a favor?" There was another wake going on in the funeral home as well, and they, anyway, the family, I guess they saw a priest. They saw me there. They made no arrangements with a church. There wasn't going to be a funeral or anything. So somebody from the family asked maybe if I could come in and also say prayers there. So I did. But before I did, I said, can you bring in some of the family so I can meet with them for 2 or 3 minutes to get just a sense of who it was that died. So the mother and the brother of the deceased came in, and the guy who died was fairly young. I think he was in his 40s, and they never actually explicitly told me how he died, but I could tell it was definitely alcohol related. He didn't, I don't think he committed suicide, but I think he probably kind of drank himself to death. The son did really most of the talking, and he kind of just referenced his demons. He kind of went back to, kept talking about the demons that his brother struggled with. The brother, the one who had died, he had a family himself, and that didn't seem very good at all. I think he was separated from his wife and estranged from, I think, most of his kids. So just a tough scene. And then the brother started to talk about their father. And he just sounded like a wild, abusive drunk who just kind of emotionally leveled his family. The brother talked about a couple of his other siblings, and they sounded like they had issues as well. Just a lot of kind of collateral damage from the impact of this alcoholic and, pretty abusive father and husband. I remember being just uncomfortable with the mother. With his mother, the wife being there. Just, he wasn't disrespecting her, but he was just. His honesty was very painful. It was kind of uncomfortable to hear with her in the room. And then eventually she spoke. And it wasn't a lot, but I really remember it. After he kind of described the whole sad saga, she then said, talking about her marriage, the father of the deceased, and she said, I just stayed too long. And I was kind of struck by that, and she just said, I should have put him out. And I thought about it countless times, but I never quite did. Always was hoping that there would be some sort of a breakthrough, and there never was. It never really got better. It just got steadily worse. Well, eventually he left, she said. He left the family, and then I think shortly after that he died. And I remember just feeling so bad for this grieving mother, the wife of this alcoholic husband. She just seemed so kind of conflicted about it all. Like this idea that, that leaving him would have been wrong, and it would have been quitting, and it would have been a failure, and a sin. I tell you, this guy just sounded like you hear these stories periodically in the news, like when in the Midwest, when there's a terrible, violent tornado, and it just destroys a little town. Everything is sort of upended. You can't it just blew through this, wrecked everything. It was almost like what this guy sounded like, except it wasn't buildings that were wrecked, it was people. She just seemed kind of tormented, this mom. Guilt of kind of having stayed. Now, sometimes you shouldn't stay. Sometimes quitting is right. It sounds weird to hear that, doesn't it? It certainly sounds uncomfortable saying it. Like quitting? Like quitting is never, we don't like quitting. We tell people not to quit. If somebody's a quitter, like that's certainly that's not a compliment, right? We see quitting as just not a good thing. Well, maybe sometimes it's a necessary thing and it's a right thing. Sometimes quitting, I think, is rescue. Had she quit on that marriage, maybe she could have rescued her kids. Maybe she wouldn't have been sitting in a funeral home. Think of this first reading tonight from Elijah, or this prophet Elijah. He wants to quit. He's done. He just can't go on. And he's like, I'm just no more. I can't do this. He's being pursued, this prophet, by a corrupt, evil leader, this queen. Her name was Jezebel. And she's awful. She hates him because of what he says. He's a prophet. And he's a really good prophet. Great prophets rock the boat because they say things that none of us want to hear. And I guess when you're the queen and you got a lot of power, you could try to silence the prophet. So she goes after him. She's in pursuit of him. She wants him dead. She doesn't want to hear the truth that he's communicating. So she's stalking him, and he's done. He's spent. He's exhausted, and he's starving. And then he says, this is what we got tonight in the reading. He says, this is enough, Lord. Take my life. And then it says this, he prayed for death. I think that's a really important short sentence. I think it's key. He prayed for death. That's the most important thing in that whole passage. He prayed. What he was praying for was a heartbreaking thing, a terrible thing. You want to die? Like, how bad off could you be? But he was pretty bad off. But you know what he did that was so right and so necessary? He brought his despair. He brought his darkness. He brought his hopelessness to God. Like, it's a prayer. It's a pretty dark prayer. Like, he's like, I just want to be done. I just want to quit. I want to be dead. But he doesn't just go and do it on his own. Like, he invites God in. He doesn't act on his despair. Actually, he acts on his faith. And that is critically important. Because God delivers. When we include God in the mix, especially when the mix is really dark and awful and seemingly hopeless, and we pull God in, God delivers. Problems don't necessarily immediately go away, but somehow we are built up and we're given the hope that we previously lacked when we ask God in. You know what I think this comes down to is when you separate faith from darkness, like when you're in a dark place, when you're overwhelmed, when you're depressed, when you are despairing, when you're heartbroken, when you feel betrayed. I mean, throw in whatever ugly emotion you want. Whenever we're feeling those things, if you separate those things from faith, and that's not a good thing. That's when terrible things happen. Heartbreaking, tragic things happen when we take God out of the mix. Hey, the reality of life is sometimes we are in a dark place and we are down and discouraged, and maybe despairing. I hope not, and I hope certainly not a lot, but come on, we have our moments. But what's worse than that is having those moments minus God. And I think that's what Elijah does. That is so important. Think of people we probably all sadly, tragically know who gave in to despair because they felt like they were fundamentally, objectively alone. Somehow along the way they forgot that, like, no, I'm in a bad way, but I'm not alone. Like, God is always here. I guess often that's forgotten. Well, the end of the Elijah story becomes hope-filled because God does deliver, and he's regained strength, and he gets it together, and he goes back out and he continues his work. He doesn't die. He doesn't act on the despair. He brought his desire to quit to God. And so should we. So must we. You know, I was reading about, I haven't really watched much at all of the Olympics, but I was reading about this gymnast, Simone Biles, who she kind of quit. She withdrew from the games. Like she's the greatest gymnast on the planet, I think, pretty much considered. And at the Olympics, she said, I'm just not going to do this. I'm not going to do it. The reaction, I thought, was really interesting. You had these extremes, really on both sides. People who trashed her because they just said, you know, she's let everyone down and she's betrayed her country. She's selfish and she's a coward. She's not a patriot. Like, terrible, and far worse than that was said about her. And on the other end, you had her sort of like elevated to this level of like beyond hero status. I was like, I don't know, is she heroic? They said she was courageous and selfless, and yeah, I think stepping away from that opportunity when you've committed a chunk of your life to it, that's a big deal. So I'm not making little of it, but I mean, I don't know, One writer compared her to Rosa Parks. I'm like, come on, Rosa Parks? She stepped away from the Olympics. I mean, she's not Rosa Parks. How about this? How about she's neither Rosa Parks nor a traitor? She's not really a hero, and she's certainly not a villain. She's somebody who had to make a decision about her life. How about we stop, or at least our culture stops, living in these extremes? You're the hero or the villain. You're the good guy or the bad guy, and there's no in-between. You know, she's Catholic, Simone. She's actually pretty public about it. And she wrote in one point, she talked about when she made her confirmation as a kid. Listen to this. She said, I marched into St. James Church, which was her parish, that Sunday in a line of teenagers with solemn faces. In a way, our procession reminded me of a medal ceremony, except that no gold, silver, or bronze would be given out. Instead, our prize would be something much more powerful. In a few moments, each of us would receive the power of God's Spirit. She said the other day, you know, in response to the attacks and the criticism, she said, you know, to those that I've let down and to those that I've disappointed, I'm sorry, but I'm more than my medals. I'm more than an athlete. I'm a human being. Sometimes quitting is okay. In her case, she ultimately kind of didn't quit because she got back into she won a medal. You know, when I was in college, and I may have mentioned this before, I remember it was my junior year of college, and I spent my first 2 years at Nassau, and then I transferred up to Cornell, upstate, and I had just gotten there, and I had a couple of days of orientation before school started, and I was loving it. And I was excited to be away, My first 2 years I was at home, all my friends were away, loving college, so I was excited now to be away. And like I said, maybe three or 4 days of orientation, just parties and fun stuff, no classes yet. And most importantly, I lucked out. I made a couple of friends like immediately. First day, I met a couple of just really good kids. Anyway, so I'm really having a great time, not even thinking about home. And I think maybe day 4, this was the plan. We all had stuff to do during the day, but that evening, we were going to meet up. We were going to go to a dinner at this diner in town, and then we were going to go to a frat party. So I get to the diner, and I'm waiting, and nobody's there. It's like there was about 6 of us total, so I'm waiting for these 5 to show up. And I'm like waiting, it's getting later and later, like way past the time we were supposed to be there, and they never showed up. Then I started to think, like in my insecurity, like I hope they didn't make other plans and not include me. So I waited a bit, and then I said, all right, I'm going to get out of here, and I went back to my dorm, and I said, all right, I'll hang out for a bit, and I'll go to the fraternity. I'll meet him there. So I go and I hanging out, and they're not there. Well, that was worse than the diner. Now I'm standing there alone at a party, not knowing anybody. I felt like the biggest loser in the world. So I'm like desperately, like I'm not waiting here long. I waited a little bit. They never showed, so I left. So now I was really down. Like, what's going on? For the first time, I started thinking about home and kind of getting homesick. Go back to my dorm, and my parents call. So I'm talking to them a bit, and I don't tell them any of this. They're just asking me how things were going, and I'm kind of answering the questions. And, this was pre-cell phone, so one landline, like my father was up in the bedroom, and my mother was down in the kitchen. The 2 phones, we're 3 of us are talking. And then we're getting ready to hang up. My mom gets off, and my dad stays on the line. And then he goes, what's going on? And I'm like, what do you mean what's going on? And he says, what's wrong? And I said, nothing's wrong. And he says, yes, something's wrong. I can tell the way you're talking. So I told him what I just told you. And, he said something to the effect of, it's going to be all right. Worst case is they did blow you off. And then if that's the case, they weren't worth the friendship anyway, and you'll find new ones. And, I kind of knew that, but I didn't want to hear that. That wasn't really helping. We were talking a little bit, and this was right before Labor Day weekend. It was probably like Wednesday or Thursday before the 3-day weekend, and we didn't have class started on Tuesday. So I say to my father, I'm thinking maybe I'll come home for the weekend. And I had no intention of coming back that early. Like when I left them 4 days before, it was like I'll see you at Thanksgiving or maybe October. There's no way I was come back within a week. So I say, yeah, I'm thinking maybe I'll come home. And then there's this pause on the phone, and then he goes, no, you can't come home. And I was like, what? What do you mean I can't come home? I couldn't believe he said no. Like I wasn't even asking for permission. I was sort of like, I'm going to come home. And he's like, no, Bri, you got to stay. I'm like, why do I have to stay? He said, because if you come home, you're not going to want to go back. Like, stay. You're going to be okay. Worst case scenario isn't the end of the world. And it may not even be that scenario. So you just got to stay, and you got to stick it out. Man, it was so not what I wanted to hear. I felt so not supported by my father. Man, it must have been tough for him when he hung up the phone, because I'm sure he felt terrible. But he was right. The next day, I get up, I'm walking across over to the dining hall, and I see 2 of the 5 of my friends. And they see me first, and they're like, hey, where were you? And I'm like, where was I? I'm like, where were you? And they were like, we were there. Where were you? I said, I was there. You weren't there. I went to the wrong diner. And then I went to the wrong frat house. I never felt so happy to be wrong in my life, because I knew at that moment, like, they didn't ditch me. So it worked out, but I wanted to quit. I think sometimes quitting is okay. Sometimes it's rescue, and sometimes it's quitting. And we shouldn't bail. I remember just being irritated at my father. You know why? Because he was being a prophet. He was telling me something that I didn't want to hear. So he became the bad guy. It's a little bit like the wicked queen who's going after Elijah. He spoke truth to power, and the power didn't like hearing it. I wasn't power, but my father spoke truth to his kid, and I didn't want to hear it. But I'm so glad that he was strong enough to do the right thing. Because who knows? Maybe I wouldn't have gone back. And man, that would have been a regret. Because I would have quit. I was reading an article with this gymnast and the whole quitting thing, and it was interesting. It was written by this psychologist. And she's talking about quitting. And she talked about her story. She was a lawyer, went to law school, practiced law, but she said she never liked it. Like, she knew before she even started practicing law that it really wasn't what she should be doing, but she had gone that far with it and she wasn't going to turn back. Well, eventually, after a couple of years of practicing law, she did. She decided to step away. She quit. She went back to school, became a psychologist, and then started her own business. Listen to what she says here. I started my business from scratch with just an idea I believed in, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done professionally. I can't count how many times I wanted to quit, but the right choice has consistently been to move forward. I wouldn't have the life or business I now have without the courage to both know when to quit and when to persevere. At the end of the day, if your choice, it's your choice, and you have to be comfortable living with whatever decision you make. I think one of the hardest parts of life is deciding whether to walk away from something or just try harder. Sometimes that decision is agonizing. She said, at the end of the day, it's your choice, and you have to be comfortable living with whatever decision you make. I think she's right. But I'd add one more piece to what she said. At the end of the day, just make sure that decision is wrapped in faith and prayer. And then it'll be the right decision. Because God delivers.